Hello, and welcome. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps dim the lights a little. Tonight, we journey back in time to the year 1930, deep within the misty landscapes of northern France. Imagine a time when silence was the master of the cobbled streets, and every dancing shadow held a secret. This is the tale of a historian, drawn by a mysterious letter to an ancient manor that had long stood watch over the land. A place that concealed something terrible beneath its very floorboards. Something that should never, ever have been disturbed. Prepare yourselves for a journey through hushed whispers, forgotten sins, and the chilling cry of black feathers on the wind. Let the storm outside your window carry you with me into the heart of the Manor of Montreuil. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoy Tales of the Night, consider subscribing so you don't miss our next adventure into the shadows. Rain fell for hours on the cobblestone streets of Montreuil-sur-Mer, a quiet town on the northern coast of France. The year was 1930, and Europe was drowning in the silence between wars. The world had slowed, and the people lived cautiously, whispering their fears into the gray mist that hung over the sea. At precisely 11 o'clock that night, Etienne Lavigne, a young historian from Paris, arrived at the old post office. He'd received a peculiar letter, written on yellowed paper and sealed with a crimson wax mark. It showed a crow with open wings, an emblem he didn't recognize. The message was brief. Monsieur Lavigne, your expertise in medieval manuscripts is required at my estate. There is something beneath the floor of Montreuil Manor that cannot remain hidden any longer. Come alone. It was signed, Comte Armand de Rochefort. Etienne had almost dismissed it as a prank, but his curiosity, a curse he had carried since childhood, compelled him to travel north. Now, drenched and cold, he stared at the massive silhouette of Rochefort Manor, half swallowed by fog at the edge of town. As he approached, the iron gate creaked open on its own. The sound echoed through the empty courtyard, startling a flock of black birds from the roof. Etienne hesitated, his gloved hand trembling on the gate. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing in on him, the smell of old wood, damp stone, and something else. Something metallic, like rust. Or maybe blood. Inside the manor, a single candle burned in the main hall. Its flame flickered, casting dancing shadows across portraits of pale nobles whose eyes seemed to follow his every move. Then a voice, dry and deliberate, broke the suffocating silence. "You came," said Comte Armand, appearing at the top of the grand staircase. He was tall and gaunt with a thin face and silver hair. His clothes were immaculate, yet his eyes held an exhaustion so profound it was as if he hadn't slept in decades. "There is something you must see, Monsieur Lavigne," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Something my family has kept buried since the Revolution." Etienne followed him down a long corridor lined with heavy velvet drapes and old, tarnished mirrors. He couldn't help but notice that his reflection in each mirror seemed slightly delayed, as if the glass itself was thinking before mimicking his movements. Finally, they reached a locked door tucked away beneath the grand staircase. The Comte produced a key carved from what looked like bone and unlocked it. A draught of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying a foul, earthy scent. "Below this floor," the Comte said softly, his voice trembling slightly, "lies a chapel that should never have been built. It was meant for worship. But what they worshipped was not God." Just then, Etienne's heart leaped into his throat. He heard it, a sound from somewhere below, from the darkness beyond the open door. It was a slow, scraping noise like stone grinding against stone. He told himself it was just rats scurrying in the foundation, but a colder, more terrifying thought took hold. Perhaps it was something else entirely. The old stairs groaned under our feet, descending deep into the earth. They were carved from ancient stone, slick and dark with moisture that seemed to weep from the walls. I held the lantern high, its single flame a fragile shield against the crushing darkness. The light trembled, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Behind me, the Comte walked, his steps eerily silent. It was unnatural. A man his age in those heavy boots should have made some sound on the stone. But there was nothing, just the soft scuff of my own shoes and the frantic beat of my heart. We finally reached the bottom. Before us stood a heavy wooden door, so old the wood was nearly black. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, circles intersected by crosses, and below them a familiar, unsettling image, a crow with its wings spread wide, just like the one on the family crest. I ran my fingers over the carvings, feeling the deep grooves. 17th century, I murmured, more to myself than to him. The craftsmanship was undeniable, but the iconography was twisted. These sigils, they're ecclesiastical, but they've been distorted. Who would do this? My ancestor, Henri de Rochefort, the Comte replied from the shadows behind me. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the stone. He was a priest once, until he built this private chapel. The church excommunicated him for it. He didn't offer any more explanation, and I didn't dare to ask. He pushed the ancient door. It swung inward on protesting hinges, and a foul odor poured out, flooding the narrow stairwell. It was a smell of deep decay, of rot and dust and something else, something ancient enough to make my lungs burn and recoil. I stepped through the doorway, holding the lantern forward. We were in a small, circular chapel. In the center, an altar was draped in black, moth-eaten cloth. I lifted the lantern higher, and its light washed over the ceiling. It was covered in magnificent murals of angels, their forms rendered with incredible skill. But their faces. Every single one had been violently scratched away, leaving only blank, scarred plaster. All that remained were their wings, painted in a stark, disturbing red that looked too much like blood. It was a place of desecrated holiness, a sanctuary turned into a prison. At the very center of the room, commanding all attention, stood a massive marble tomb. It was stark white against the gloom, a cold and silent monument. The Comte finally broke the silence, and for the first time I heard a tremor in his voice. "I need you to translate the inscription," he said, gesturing toward the tomb with a shaking hand. I nodded, my own throat suddenly dry. This was why he'd brought me here, the historian, the expert in dead languages. This was the secret he'd been hiding. I knelt beside the cold marble, the chill seeping through the knees of my trousers. A thick layer of gray dust coated the surface, softening the sharp edges of the carved letters. I carefully brushed it away with my sleeve, revealing the Latin words etched into the stone. I read them aloud, my voice a whisper in the dead air. Hic dormit illa quae audivit vocem sub terra. I translated slowly, the meaning settling like a stone in my gut. Here sleeps she who heard the voice beneath the earth. I looked up at the Comte, my mind racing. She? I asked, frowning. This tomb belongs to a woman? The Comte gave a single sharp nod, his face a mask of weary dread in the flickering lamplight. My ancestor's wife, Madeleine de Rochefort. The family records state she died of a sudden fever. But Henri's private journals, they tell a very different story. He paused, taking a ragged breath. He wrote that she began to hear voices, whispers coming from the soil itself. He said the very ground beneath this manor. It spoke to her. A cold dread, colder than the marble beneath my hands, crept up my spine, the voice beneath the earth. My gaze fell back to the tomb, and that's when I saw it. A fine, hairline crack running across the lid. It was almost invisible, but it was there. A dark line against the pale marble, as if something had once pushed against it from the inside. Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. A soft, muffled thudding that echoed in the oppressive silence of the chapel. Knock, knock, knock. It sounded like fingers rapping gently against stone. I froze completely, every muscle in my body tensed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. There was only that sound. Knock, knock. The Comte's voice was a ghost at my ear, a strained and terrified whisper. It always happens at midnight. The lantern flame in my hand shuddered violently, as if caught in a sudden draught, casting our shadows into a wild, frantic dance against the walls. And in that terrifying final moment, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the walls, or the floor, or the ceiling. The soft, insistent knocking was coming from within the tomb itself, and midnight was just seconds away. Thank you so much for joining me on this descent into darkness. If you enjoy tales of gothic horror and secrets buried in the earth, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that explore the shadows. Ring the bell so you won't miss our next adventure. Until then, stay curious and be careful what secrets you go digging for. That night, Etienne could not find sleep. He was a guest in the Comte's grand manor, given a room that should have been a sanctuary. Yet the deep, oppressive silence of the estate was a lie. It was a canvas painted with sounds he wished he couldn't hear. Unseen movements filled the void. The soft scuff of footsteps in the corridor just outside his door, faint whispers that seemed to slip right through the keyhole, and a slow, dragging sound, something heavy being shifted beneath the very floorboards of his room. He tried to dismiss it as the old house settling, as the wind playing tricks. But the feeling of being watched was unshakable. To calm his fraying nerves, he lit a cigarette, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the encroaching dread. He watched the smoke spiral upward, a gray phantom dancing in the moonlight that streamed through the tall window. For a moment, the tendrils of smoke twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, like fleeting specters, before they dissolved into the deep shadows that clung to the corners of the room. It did little to soothe him. The unease remained, a cold knot in his stomach. And then it began. At exactly midnight, the faint humming returned. It was the same sound he'd heard earlier from the chapel, but now it felt closer, more intimate. It emanated from deep below, a vibration he could feel in his bones. The sound rose through the manor's ancient structure like a mournful song, muffled and uneven, as if sung by a voice buried alive, struggling for air, for release. It was a sound of profound sorrow and desperate longing. Curiosity, mixed with the chilling sense of duty, warred with his fear. He couldn't just lie there pretending not to hear it. The sound was a hook, pulling him in. Extinguishing the cigarette, Etienne grabbed his lantern, the small flame a defiant spark against the overwhelming darkness. He followed the sound, his own footsteps echoing the ghostly ones he'd heard earlier. It led him, inevitably, back down the cold, winding staircase he had discovered behind the tapestry. Back to the hidden passage that snaked through the heart of the manor, back towards the source of the humming. The stone steps were cold and slick beneath his boots. The air grew heavier, colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and funereal. The humming grew louder with every step he took, the melody becoming clearer, a lament that vibrated through the very stones around him. It guided him through the darkness until he reached the end of the passage. The chapel door was ajar, a sliver of darkness deeper than the rest. He pushed it open gently. The scene inside stole his breath. The Comte stood before the massive stone tomb, his back to Etienne. The old man's shoulders were shaking, a visible tremor running through his entire body. He was holding a small, ornate silver mirror in his hand, clutching it like a holy relic. He was staring into it, utterly transfixed. "She speaks to me through this," the Comte whispered, his voice a ragged, broken thing. He hadn't even noticed Etienne's arrival. "Every night, she tells me of her cold prison." Etienne took a cautious step forward, his gaze drawn to the mirror in the Comte's trembling hand. And in its polished surface, reflected in the flickering lantern light, he saw it. It was just for a second, a flicker at the edge of his vision. Behind the Comte's own haggard reflection there was another face, a pale, luminous face of a young woman, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to transcend death, her mouth open in a silent, unending scream. A jolt of pure ice shot through Etienne's veins. He whipped his head up, looking at the space directly behind the Comte. There was nothing. just empty air and the cold stone of the chapel wall. The space was vacant, yet the image burned into his mind. "What did you see?" Etienne asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I tried to keep her quiet," the Comte confessed, his voice cracking with a grief that seemed centuries old. "I tried to appease her, but she calls to anyone who listens, anyone with a heart that can hear her sorrow." He turned, his eyes wild with desperation. "The curse. It began the moment my ancestor, Henri, disobeyed her dying wish. She wanted to remain buried in consecrated ground, with her family. But he, in his grief and madness, brought her here. He trapped her." Etienne's attention was drawn back to the tomb itself. The crack he had noticed earlier, the fine fissure in the marble lid, had widened. It was no longer just a hairline fracture, and from within this dark crevice something glistened in the lantern light. A thin, dark liquid was slowly seeping out, tracing a dark path down the side of the sarcophagus. He leaned closer, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The coppery scent hit him a moment later. It was blood, fresh blood. Suddenly, without any wind or warning, the flame in his lantern dimmed, sputtering as if starved of air. The light shrank to a tiny, weak point, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced on the walls. The air in the chapel turned thick and cloying, heavy with the unmistakable stomach-churning stench of decay. It was a physical presence, pressing in on him, making it hard to breathe. And then he heard it. Not the distant humming, not the whispers through the keyhole. This was different. A whisper, clear and soft, spoken directly into his ear. "Help me out." He stumbled back, a cry catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakably feminine, young, and filled with a heart-wrenching desperation. It was the voice of the face in the mirror. At that exact moment, the Comte let out a choked sob and dropped the silver mirror. It hit the stone floor and shattered, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. For one horrifying, kaleidoscopic moment, Etienne saw her face reflected in every single piece, her spectral white skin, her hollow, pleading eyes, her dark hair floating around her as if she were suspended in water. 1,000 screaming faces, all looking at him. Then, the whisper became a scream, a full-throated, ear-splitting shriek of rage and despair that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The lantern flame gave one final, pathetic flicker and went out, plunging the chapel into absolute, suffocating darkness. The scream echoed, and then silence, a silence more terrifying than the scream itself, and in that suffocating, pitch-black void, Etienne felt it, a cold that was not of this world, a cold, slender hand touching his own. Etienne awoke to a chilling silence, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged just hours before. He was on the cold stone floor of the family chapel, dust motes dancing in the faint moonlight that pierced the gloom. A gasp escaped his lips. The Comte's tomb, a massive sarcophagus of black marble, was open. The heavy lid, which had required 4 men to move, was pushed aside as if it were a mere blanket. And the Comte was gone. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling, every muscle aching. The air was thick, not just with dust, but with an ancient, earthy scent, like a freshly dug grave. He stumbled towards the open tomb, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Peering inside, he found no sign of the Comte's body. Instead, the velvet lining was covered with a pile of dried black feathers. Each one was the color of a starless midnight, impossibly dark, absorbing the little light that touched them. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down his spine. Then he saw them. A trail of footprints, stark crimson against the pale stone, leading away from the tomb and towards the stairs. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat. These were not the prints of a man. They were slender, bird-like, with the distinct vicious outline of talons. What unholy thing had emerged from that grave? Driven by a morbid mix of fear and loyalty, Etienne knew he had to follow. He had to find the Comte. He ascended the grand staircase, the manor groaning around him with each step. It felt as if the house itself was waking from a long slumber, its wooden bones creaking in protest. The ancestral portraits that lined the walls, usually so stoic and proud, had transformed into grotesque masks of horror. The painted eyes of long-dead nobles now wept tears of thick black ooze, their once dignified mouths twisted into silent, eternal screams. The familiar faces of the Comte's lineage had become a gallery of the damned. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling within these walls. The trail of bloody talon prints led him to the library, the heart of the manor. The door was ajar, and a single candle flickered within, casting long, dancing shadows. And there, in the center of the room, was the Comte. He was sitting in his favorite high-backed chair, perfectly still, his back to the door. He was staring intently at a portrait hanging above the fireplace, a painting of a woman in a severe black dress, her face pale and her expression unreadable. Madeleine, the Comte's late wife, who had died a century ago. As Etienne drew closer, a detail in the painting made his blood run cold. Madeleine's hand, which should have been resting delicately on a book, was gone. The canvas was bare where her fingers should have been, as if she had simply pulled her hand out of the frame, and then he saw what was perched on the Comte's shoulder. A single, large black crow, its feathers shimmering like oil in the candlelight. Its eyes, two beads of obsidian, gleamed with an unsettling, unnatural intelligence as they fixed on him. The Comte's voice was a dry, rasping whisper, devoid of all its former authority. "She promised me eternity, Etienne." He didn't turn, his gaze still locked on the portrait. My brother, Henri. He thought he was summoning an angel to bring her back, a guardian to watch over our family line. A hollow, broken laugh escaped his lips. But angels do not crawl from graves. At that moment, the crow turned its head, a slow, deliberate movement. It stared directly at Etienne. It didn't caw or screech. Instead, a voice bloomed inside his mind, cold and ancient, like stones grinding together in the deep earth. The earth remembers all who were buried in sin, and she reclaims her own. The psychic intrusion was a physical blow. Etienne staggered back, his mind reeling. He collided with a heavy, ornate candelabrum, sending it crashing to the floor. Wax and flame spilled across the priceless antique carpet. Fire erupted, spreading with terrifying speed, licking at the dry tapestries and ancient books. The room was instantly filled with smoke and the roar of the growing inferno. The crow, unfazed by the chaos, spread its wings. They were immense, far larger than any natural bird. For a fleeting, heart-stopping second, its shadow cast against the wall of flames took on a new form. It was the silhouette of a woman, impossibly tall, skeletal, her face obscured by a veil of feathers. It was the shape of death itself. The Comte finally screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror as the crow, the creature, dug its talons into his shoulder. It wasn't attacking him, it was merging with him. His body convulsed violently, the horrifying sound of bones snapping and rearranging echoing through the library. Black feathers burst from his skin, tearing through his fine clothes. His human form twisted and contorted, collapsing in on itself. Etienne didn't wait to see the final monstrous result. He turned and ran. He fled through the burning library down the hallway of screaming portraits, the heat of the fire scorching his back. Behind him, a new sound ripped through the manor, a terrible, unholy cry that was half the shriek of a man in agony and half the guttural call of a monstrous bird. The lord of the manor was no more. Something new, something ancient and hungry, now claimed it as its nest. Etienne ran into the night, the monstrous cry chasing him. The image of feathers and fire burned forever into his mind. He didn't look back. Thank you so much for watching this tale unfold. If you enjoy stories that explore the shadows, Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the unknown. We'll see you in the next one. Etienne fled into the heart of the raging storm, his lungs burning with every desperate gasp. He didn't dare look back, but a sudden, blinding flash of lightning forced him to. For a horrifying split second, the silhouette of Montreuil Manor was etched against the sky, consumed by flames. Its windows, once dark and empty, now glowed a malevolent red, like the eyes of some colossal beast. Then he heard it, a sound that turned his blood to ice. The frantic, furious beating of wings, vast and impossibly close, slicing through the wind and rain. He stumbled blindly forward, his feet finding purchase on uneven ground. Another lightning strike revealed his new surroundings. The ancient, neglected cemetery that lay hidden behind the estate. Weather-beaten tombstones jutted from the earth like the broken teeth of a giant skull. The sound of wings grew louder, a vortex of fury directly overhead. A colossal shadow swooped down, blotting out the sky. Without thinking, Etienne dove behind a crumbling granite headstone, clutching the small flickering lantern as if it were his only salvation. The rain hissed violently as it struck something intensely hot just a few feet away, releasing a plume of acrid steam. Then a voice cut through the tempest. It was soft, melodic, and chillingly familiar. "Etienne, you freed me." It was her, the voice from the tomb. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying it was a hallucination, a trick of his terrified mind. But when he opened them, she was there. Emerging from the swirling smoke and torrential rain was Madeleine. Her form was a nightmare, a grotesque fusion of woman and crow. Her eyes burned like molten gold, filled with an ancient predatory intelligence. Black feathers, slick with rain, clung to her pale arms, and her mouth twisted into a smile far too wide, too sharp to be human. "You opened the door," she whispered, her voice a caress and a threat all at once. "Now, we are awake again." Etienne's hand trembled so violently the lantern's light danced crazily across her monstrous features. What are you?" he stammered, his own voice barely a croak. She tilted her head, a bird-like gesture that was profoundly unsettling. "I am the echo of his sin," she explained, her golden eyes boring into his. "The wife who was buried alive, and the hunger he left behind." With those cryptic words, she extended a hand toward him, but it was no longer a human hand. It was a gnarled, scaly claw, tipped with obsidian talons. As her claw reached for him, the very ground beneath the graves began to tremble. The earth convulsed, and with a sickening sound of snapping and splintering, skeletal hands and arms began to push their way up through the mud-soaked soil. Skulls cracked open not from age, but from a horrifying internal pressure, as torrents of black feathers erupted from within them. The air was filled with the deafening screams of dozens then hundreds of crows as they burst from the desecrated graves and spiraled into the storm-blackened sky, a living vortex of shadow and rage circling the ruin of the manor. Etienne turned to run, to escape this waking nightmare, but the ground gave way beneath him. With a cry of sheer terror, he plummeted into cold, absolute darkness, the sensation of falling lasting an eternity. He landed hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He was back in the chapel, but it was horribly changed. The stone walls seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic beat, as if the entire structure were alive and breathing. He looked up at the mural, at the serene faces of the angels he had studied just hours before. Their wings were gone. In their place were empty, weeping sockets, bleeding a thick black ichor that stained the ancient stone. Madeleine's voice echoed from every corner of the chapel, a disembodied, omnipresent whisper. "The crow always returns to its nest." The air grew thick, pressing in on him, suffocating him. The last thing Etienne saw before the darkness swallowed him completely was a face forming in the shadows, the face of the Comte de Montreuil. But it was twisted, merged with feathers and beak, his mouth stretched into a silent, eternal grin of unending agony. When morning finally broke, the storm had passed. A weak, watery sun illuminated the smoldering ruins of Montreuil Manor. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind only blackened stone and scorched earth. And the crows. Thousands of them, perched silently on every available surface, their obsidian eyes watching the world with an unnerving stillness. The townspeople, drawn by the smoke, eventually came to search for the young historian, Etienne Lavigne. They searched for days, combing through the debris and the surrounding woods. But they found no body. They found no trace of him at all. All they found was his small leather-bound notebook, lying open in the mud near the cemetery gate, its pages soaked with rain. On the final page, a single line was visible, written in a frantic, trembling ink that had bled into the paper. "The voice beneath the earth still speaks."